Welcome to The Whole Pineapple. I'm Ruby Boris.
And I'm Ann Judge. The Whole Pineapple is a podcast about wellness focused around fertility. We'll talk with experts on a wide range of topics, including nutrition, stress relief, sleep, mental health, etc.
And we'll dig into the issues that can cause fertility challenges, like PCOS, or early menopause, or cancer treatment.
So if you're curious about your fertility, whether you're ready to start a family,
or you're preserving your options for the future, let's dig in. Hello, everyone. We are stopping in here today to just give you a little update on some structural changes that we're going to be doing with the podcast. Don't worry. We're still going to be here. We're still here. Yeah. We're still going to be here every week. We are just going to be decreasing the amount of content that is coming out every week so we can continue being our best clinical selves and best home selves and best podcasters for you.
Exactly. Like we talk about with you, we're doing a little bit of self-care here and pulling back a little bit with our frequency and contact. We're still going to be talking to the same experts. We're still going to be doing full and snack episodes, but we're going to space out the release a little bit more to have a full episode on a Thursday and then the snack episode the following Thursday. So instead of having 2 in a week when we talk with an expert, we're just going to space it out a little bit to give ourselves a little more time in our lives, but still give you all that good quality content. And that's going to be starting this week. So enjoy our full episode and then tune in on next Thursday to hear our snack episode.
We have a really special guest today, and it's a topic that we haven't really talked about too much. I mean, I think we've talked about it a little bit because of just where we are. We are really close by lots of military bases here in Tacoma and Seattle. We wanted to talk a little bit more about the experiences of those who are in the military and first responders and how they experience infertility. And it turns out there is actually an organization for that. Kind of like there's an app for that. There's an organization for that. And it's fantastic. So we are talking with Mollie Huyck today. And I'm just really excited to meet with her. Should I introduce her, Ann?
Let's do it. Yeah.
Mollie Huyck is the founder and president of Roaring Adventures, a 501c3 nonprofit organization supporting first responders and active duty military members through education, services, and resources, including financial assistance and through family building grants. After experiencing her own fertility journey and coming from 20 years plus of experience in the field of nursing, health, and wellness, Mollie saw the need to provide support to first responder and military families who are affected by infertility. She's also the co-founder of My Fertility Health, Inc., which created Navie. Is that how you pronounce that? Navie? Okay.
Like an avatar? Like
Navie.
Okay.
Not intentional, but...
Yeah, no, I was like, I have to make sure this is the avatar. Which created Navie, a comprehensive software platform designed to provide tools and support to those navigating their reproductive health and fertility journeys.
Oh, like navigate, right? So is that where the Navie? I
Navigate.
Get it now. Okay.
Oh, that's where that came from. Got it. She's also a children's book author. Her book is called I Became Your Mama and was inspired by her own journey to parenthood and was created as a resource for parents to share their personal stories with their children. So definitely check that out wherever you get your books.
You know we love the
Mollie.
Children's books. So.
Oh, for real. Yeah, for sure. Mollie is an advocate for family building causes in the state of Oregon and across the United States, and we are so fortunate to spend some time with her today. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here with you both today.
Yeah, well, you've done so many things. So.
And it's an organization that you wouldn't necessarily realize is out there, but then when you think about it, you're like, oh, yes, we absolutely need that.
So maybe tell us a little bit about that. Like, how did Roaring Adventures start?
Sure.
You know, whatever you want to share about your personal story. Like, how did you get to where you are now?
Absolutely. I'm happy to share. So Roaring Adventures really came through our own personal journey with infertility. We went through 7 years of unexplained infertility up to the point where Roaring Adventures is now. We unfortunately lost 9 little ones through recurrent miscarriage and loss and welcomed our daughter into the world, if you will, through embryo donation and gestational surrogacy. And for, many, it says it takes a village. They say it takes a village to have a child. For us, it really took a village to have a child. And so through that, it was originally Roaring Adventures started for me as a blog, as a place that I could go to write, to heal through our infertility journey.
Yeah.
Quickly became I Became Your Mama as we welcomed our little one into the world. And as I leaned in more to discover a way both to honor our daughter's birth story, I learned through that as a nurse, and my husband is a firefighter, and my daughter has connections as well genetically to those that serve in the military, as do we. And it was a way both to serve, really support and honor her story, but at the same time, we saw a need across the United States, specifically for first responders and active military that were experiencing infertility at what we saw was a higher rate than the average public, if you will.
And I think a lot of people, if you're not, I mean, people just don't have any idea really like what, I think like, oh, well, don't they have health insurance that covers it? So like, what is the current situation for most people when it comes to if you are military and what you have in terms of fertility coverage?
I think on both sides within the United States, currently only 14 states have mandated coverage outside of the military. And so in many cases, like Oregon and in Washington, we don't have fertility coverage that is mandated. And though the military has some coverage, there are stipulations and rules, if you will, that are in place in order to qualify for that benefit or that coverage. And so it's really created in some ways barriers to care on both sides within the first responder community as well as the active military community to access that care. With any of us that are in fertility, we know that fertility has a finite timeline. And so sometimes in many cases, individuals or couples are pursuing treatment or accessing care because the wait times are so long. And so there is a financial impact that also follows that even outside of the Pacific Northwest.
I'm sure Ruby probably has more experience with that being down in Tacoma and near Madigan.
Down in Tacoma.
So I know I was surprised when I first started working here how we would have our patients that would cycle through in batches through Madigan. And then every now and again, I'd get someone not in a batch. I'd be like, well, what are you doing here? Like, well, I didn't want to wait 3 years. It's tough because it's so fortunate that there is coverage in some sense, but I know it can be really hard when you're ready to build your family to be told you have to wait and wait.
And I think the other piece too, if there's that qualifier, if they aren't based here or if both partners are serving in the military and one is deployed, there's also those factors that come into play. So when you're trying to time life and family building and your professional career, a lot of factors, I think, go into that, specifically for military families.
And you mentioned limitations. There's limitations in terms of like using donor gametes and stuff too, right? Because I feel like when I see patients down here, when they're going outside the system on their own, it's usually patients that are wanting to use like donor sperm or some other avenue that their system just isn't equipped for or don't provide.
Exactly. I mean, I think the other piece too that we see is they have a requirement as well of being in the same space or same household, sometimes 6 months up to a year in order to also qualify. And so depending on those deployments or the type of treatment that they're seeking, that can also impact what we see for coverage as well.
Absolutely. They move around so much and then having to come to a home base. Yeah. Like you said, when you're dealing with a finite time period and all the other complications that just life throw at you, it makes it really hard to wait and find the time where you're actually eligible to do all these things.
And you mentioned the rates too. I think sometimes people are surprised by that. They think, well, people that are first responders, aren't they by nature young and healthy? And shouldn't they be less likely to have fertility issues? So maybe talk a little bit about what actually we find.
Yeah. So with first responders, we see about 1.5 to 2 times higher rate of infertility. And a big part of that is what we have found is, and in studies that have been conducted, is the exposures, the environmental exposures.
Let's maybe like define what first responder is so people kind of understand like generally what we're talking about. Because I feel like sometimes we have an idea of what that means. And most people think like, oh, EMTs, firefighters, but it's wider than that. So like maybe let's define that first.
So for us, we actually did expand the definition of first responders. That came for Roaring Adventures through the pandemic. So our definition of first responder is firefighters, police, paramedics, EMT, 911 dispatchers, and that traditionally is the definition of first responder, but we also added nurses. We really saw...
Yay, nurses.
Yay, nurses.
I know. You're talking to the right audience about that. So.
And much like you both saw as well, like we really saw that impact for first responders and nurses serving on the front lines during the middle of the pandemic and even outside of that, even prior to that and beyond to where we're at now. And so we really just found that need to include, rooted in our mission of supporting first responders, but aligning also with honoring our daughter's birth story. And so it really just came together organically, both through the need and then what we saw as a need within the communities that we serve.
So then within that broad definition, you find those rates that are higher. And is that kind of across the board? Is it higher in, men versus women? Or, I mean, how much data do they have when they really try to explore this issue?
The sad part is there's not too many studies that have been done. Roaring Adventures is on that forefront of also working toward completing a study that can give us more information with some partners that we have across the United States. But as part of that, we see that infertility doesn't discriminate when it comes to first responders or anyone in the US. And so we do see that it's corresponding both for those that identify as female and those that identify as male, whether that be ovulatory concerns or issues, sperm quality or sperm count. We see that those are impacted by the exposures that first responders experience, and active military as part of that as well.
And what kind of exposures are you thinking about? What is the working theory for what people are having?
Yeah, this has always been something that I'm really curious about. I always hear exposures. I'm like, well, what exactly? Coming from a family, somebody that doesn't have a lot of direct military experience in my family, it's like, what exactly are you exposed to?
Yeah, and so I'm going to lean into even the definition from the American American Cancer Society. They share that all types of fire, as an example, create a mixture of toxic combustion products. And so as part of that could be in liquids, gases, particulates that are in the air. We also see that firefighter equipment specifically also contains chemicals that can release what we know as carcinogens. And we see a direct correlation to those exposures.
Oh, great. So it's the fire itself and the stuff you're wearing to protect you.
Yes, like you're protecting yourself from fire and the fire. Great.
And other exposures, when we think of military, those that, let's say, are pilots as part of that, and they're exposed to diesel fumes or diesel trucks, fire trucks often or vehicles are diesel and have that exposure. And so we see that between being on an active scene and being even back at your home station or home base or agency, if you're in law enforcement, as part of that, we see that those exposures don't just stop when you're on a call, but often come back. Just like you said, like if you're in your turnouts and you know that you've just fought a fire and you have to take all of that gear off, you're not wearing your breathing apparatus at that point, you're exposed to those elements. So.
And speaking of like uniforms and stuff too, I always think on the sperm side of things anyway, for those with sperms, like especially like fatigues and any of those uniforms that people wear, they look very hot. They don't look like they're probably the best environment for sperm health.
Very true. I mean, and we see that too with depending on the layers also of if they have time with the layers of gear between putting on their turnouts to go onto a call or their gear, what are those levels of protection between that? And often that's another challenge that we hear often. The heat exposure, absolutely. We hear that pretty regularly as well. And many of the individuals or couples that we've helped, it has been equal, either because they've been working so hard and exercising and having such a laborious type of position if you're a woman. And so we see that that impacts that side of things. And then also on the male factor side as well.
Well, that's why it makes so much sense when you're talking about the pandemic and expanding that definition. I think that was really eye-opening to realize, those of us that work in healthcare, the difference between people that could at home sit on their couch with a laptop and still do their same job versus those of us that were like on our feet and exposed to people and exposed to stressful situations. And there's not a way of doing that job without being in those situations. So I think it's important to recognize, as you say, those stresses, even for people that aren't necessarily being clouded in toxic chemicals. There's still a lot of things that are potentially impairing your fertility just in the nature of bedside care.
Absolutely. I think the other thing that we see is the stress, the environmental, outside of environmental stress, but the post-traumatic stress or the events of being on scene or on different calls, and just how that correlates when you come home to transition to your relationship with your partner and being in that space to want to grow your family or create your family. And so I think some of those elements come up from the psychosocial side as well.
And from the psychological point, just the stress of having one person deployed. There's just an article earlier this week about, I guess in the Ukraine, the high rates of soldiers that are now being encouraged to bank sperm before they go. And there is like a patriotic, like, we're going to make sure that even if I don't come back, you're like, I mean, I see that, but gosh, that's right. That's in the back of everybody's mind with every deployment. And like, I can see how banking sperm first in some ways is comforting, but also it's like you're really acknowledging that mortality risk. And
I was going to say, that's like a big dose of reality right there, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like, I think these are the things that people probably don't want to directly address when they're saying goodbye to somebody before a deployment, but I'm sure it is. It's there in your mind, and it's there as this baseline stress that you just can't avoid.
Yeah, and in a specific example, one of our recipients, he was deployed at the time and had banked his sperm before he had left on deployment, and they were a recipient of our grant, and he was actually on a submarine when we called to let them know that they were one of our first recipients of the grant. And so she was ready to keep moving forward, and he wasn't even aware because of communication that was about to happen for them. And so they moved forward, and when he surfaced and came back, he was able to learn that they were able to move forward with IVF treatment. And that was a pretty exciting,
a great surprise coming off
really
the boat. I did have one patient that it was really interesting, who was freezing her eggs, and she was on like a boat in the middle of the ocean. I'm like, this is so weird for me, because I'm like sitting here in my little office. I'm like, you're way out, like in the middle, literally the middle of nowhere. And you're like, hopefully the satellites, work well, but...
And you're happy to do all the time zone calculations for like when you're going to be doing things.
Oh yeah, she was pretty amazing. She got it all organized, and so I'm like, wow, you're an organized person.
And like in one sense, it's wonderful to be able to keep moving forward with your treatment even when one of you is gone. But in another sense, that's so hard because like you want your partner there with you for every step along the way. And so I'm sure that's a really tough decision for some people, but you're right, like biological time is moving too. And so if someone's on a really long deployment, not everybody can wait that time before they actually move forward with, for example, IUI or IVF cycles.
Yeah, I think we see both sides of that too. Just like you said, in many cases, the partner that is here wants to wait until they know that their significant other or partner is coming back within, 30 to 60 days. But depending on the orders and the patient or the person that's here, their comfortability level with moving forward, we see that it's pretty split, right? At least for our organization, we see about 50-50. 50% move forward and 50% say, we're so grateful that you're going to support us throughout. And so even if someone isn't eligible for a grant or doesn't want to apply for a grant through us, we also provide them with support and resources on a gamut of different opportunities. And so it doesn't just stop at the grant. It's much more than that for anyone that's within those communities through us.
And that's wonderful. We're going to make our snack episode talking more about like, how does someone apply for a grant? What covers in a grant? How do you choose? So we're deliberately not talking about that right now because we want that to be our little standalone.
Yeah, you're like, wait, you cue in, you're like, wait, what is this? So yeah, we will be talking about that in more detail too. So check that out. But this is a good thing to point out that Roaring Adventures is not just about grants. It's so much more support than that.
So you mentioned that first example. Do you have any other examples of the kinds of situations that Roaring Adventures has been able to help people out in?
I have a donor story I'd love to share. And then even another example of one of our recipients. So one of our donors that really helped establish Roaring Adventures from the very beginning and is actively involved with us now, it actually was a personal story or a private story of a patient in the Seattle area, actually, that aren't first responders, but they were going through medical treatment for the very first time, and they were doing an IVF cycle. And they were at home, they prepped everything, they had everything out on their kitchen island ready to go. And her husband gives her her first injection, and she goes down like a rock in the kitchen and passes out. And her husband thinks, oh my word, I have just killed my wife with our very first injection.
It's like in the movies, there must have been some air in the syringe and that's what happened.
Completely. Panics, calls 911.
And that's where our mind goes to. Yeah. Like if you work anywhere near like any kind of first responder or healthcare, you automatically go to the zebra with what's going to happen. And you're like, that's not right. Wait, that's not right, right? That didn't just happen, right?
So he calls 911 thinking,
oh no,
oh my goodness, what have I done? Paramedics show up, they come to the house, and she obviously wakes up. And the medic happened to notice that on the counter, there were IVF medications. Their meds
Yeah.
were out across the counter. And he said, "Are you going through medical treatment? Are you going through IVF?" And he himself, as a medic, had gone through IVF to grow his family. It was
Oh,
that moment for them where they felt, as patients, they felt supported. They felt seen. They didn't feel so alone, because at the time they didn't know anyone that was going through fertility treatment or were experiencing infertility. And so they have stayed very connected with us in recognizing what first responders do and how in those moments, they can be moments of magic or moments of misery. And for them, even though it felt like a moment of misery, very quickly turned into an opportunity to connect and relate to someone else. And so
Wow.
we're very fortunate to have them as ongoing contributors and donors, and that recognize that we're paying this forward directly through what we do.
That is a
So
lovely story.
it
Wow.
is. It's very heartwarming. I love that.
And it's always funny to me in my daily life, because I'm certainly not shy about talking about fertility stories, like how many people I have had big conversations with. Because, someone like obliquely mentions, I was like, I'm glad to talk about what's been going on. And you do realize it's so much more common.
Mhm.
And sometimes if you just put the word out there, yeah, the person behind you in the grocery store, this and that, they might be like, oh, I did IVF too. And it just turns into a whole thing. So,
so true. That's so true. I will say, even this year, we have another recipient, first responder, firefighter, and his wife is a nurse and works for a very large hospital system. They had done IVF for the last 6 years, recurrent loss, unexplained infertility as well. They were down to their final remaining embryo, and had to come to that crossroads of, do we do another cycle? Do we consider switching clinics? Do I carry? Do I need to find a gestational carrier? And the happy news is, on the other side of that, they're now expecting. They're 12 weeks along with their final embryo as part of that. And we've been really fortunate to have an incredible clinic partner that came alongside of us as well to support them in their journey. And it's been amazing to see, one, the opportunity to open up and share their personal story, which I think takes a lot of courage, just to
yeah.
be open to telling someone else and sharing something so personal and
Mhm.
intimate, but then to also have, I think for them, that happy ending, and for quite a few others, a happy ending. I think the third one that I would love to be able to share too is that with us, it's not always just about the happy endings. I think so many people go through infertility and that journey, and in some cases, maybe that happy ending doesn't happen, but they're able to come to resolve and closure, and are presented with an opportunity to try. And try means whatever that might look like for them. It's not just about medical treatment through Roaring Adventures. It could be that they might pursue foster to adoption, or the list goes on of different ways that people can grow their families.
So when you're giving grants, it's not only like IVF grants, it's things that can be used for other means as well. Is that right?
Absolutely.
That's great. That's very unique when it comes to fertility financial coverage for things, or opportunities for people. That's really awesome to have something that is not just directly fertility treatment, medications, all that kind of stuff.
It's been really incredible too to sit with people, whether that be, we run support groups as well, virtually and in person, whether it be to sit with them in those moments and those hard times and help them navigate through that, and to try to decide how they want to move forward or not move forward, but coming alongside of them in other ways as well, as they decide what's best for their family. And family could be defined as two for us.
Mhm.
So
And it's important to realize, everyone's got a different scale of what they need for treatment. I mean, I think working here, sometimes you forget there are people that really just need medications to help ovulate and do that safely with an ultrasound, and they just financially can't even, afford the ultrasounds and the meds. And so it's not like it's only IVF. There are some people that can benefit even from just that small infusion of funds to help them do those low technology treatments too. So I think it's amazing that your organization has such a broad definition of what you're able to do. How do you work with different clinics? Like, how does that work in terms of, you mentioned your clinic partnerships for that example of patients?
we've been very fortunate through Roaring Adventures to have partners across many different networks. And that could be the Pinnacle Network as an example, or Ivy Network, and the list goes on. So we've partnered with clinics from ORM Fertility, OHSU, Pacific Northwest Fertility, Boston CCRM, fertility specialists in California, And the list goes on and on.
You got all the big names. You're shouting out all the good
For
ones.
people that don't know all the networks, but I'm like, those are the big ones.
We feel so fortunate where we feel like our role within Roaring Adventures is to really build as many bridges as possible and opportunities for being patient-centered and patient-focused. And so for us, that includes even resources outside of that, like at-home testing partners that we've worked with. Children's books obviously is very close and near and dear to my heart. And so we have a network of partners that we have even in the children's book space that'll be coming out. And those announcements will be coming soon. And so recognizing both ends of the spectrum of clinic partners, adoption agencies, surrogacy agencies, attorneys that have partnered with us, nutritional partners, wellness partners, and identifying both for first responders and military the need for mental health and wellness as part of that, and how all of that is connected.
I start making it like a noise. I'm so excited about it.
So really from end to end. And so we feel like that though our grant just focuses on fertility or those that have been diagnosed with infertility, we really see the value of providing those touch points leading up to that. And then even beyond that into being a parent or raising, as an example, a donor conceived child. And what are those resources and what they look like so that we can raise healthy, incredible human beings. So,
which is such a great point, because it's not just about having the child. It's like you want to really be able to, as you said, not just like tell their story, but like be proud of their story. You know, it's such an amazing way that so many people can come together to create this family. And so I think now that things like donor egg, donor embryo, all of that is so much more common now than it used to be. And I think people are realizing how this needs to be part of the story from the very beginning, so that it doesn't ever come as a shock. And so the more resources that are out there, it's so wonderful. And it can be used in people in all different kinds of families.
Yeah, and if you think about, I'm thinking of like the 6 series of Kevin Bacon, like just like how resources, like it might not be something that you automatically would think would be related to fertility, but it's surprising where you find connections.
I absolutely agree.
So what was your order of things? So you said you had a blog. Was it like blog and then organization and book, or blog and book and organization? Or how did you end up, having such...
How did it happen?
Yeah.
Or all at the same time, because that's what nurses do.
Yeah.
So I had the blog really before we even had our daughter. And I started to advocate through Federal Advocacy Day, which is annual here in the US for each state. And I started to work with Resolve, the National Infertility Association. I have done that for about 10 years, specifically for the state of Oregon, but for those that don't know, across the United States. And so really focused on how do we expand access for everyone, not just first responders and military, and saw that need. And so that's where it originated in terms of just getting started. When we knew that our daughter was coming, I really wanted to be able, selfishly, I wanted a tool to be able to share her birth story with her, and not quite sure. And I was so proud of how she came to be, but wanted to find a tool or a way that I could share that for a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old and have it just be a part of our normal story, because that is a part, we're so proud of it. And it's just such a part of us. And so I started, next was the children's book. And really during that time of creating the blog and working toward growing our family, I had told my husband, I said, one day, and sometimes I still get a little knot in my throat, even all these years later. One day we'll have the opportunity to pay it forward, because so many people came forward to help us. Aww. And the doors that have opened and the opportunities to serve others and see the impact that it has for families that we've had the opportunity to connect with have been unparalleled. I'm so sorry.
You're going to make us cry too. You're talking to emotional nurses.
I got the little chill down my spine.
Yeah. So it really grew organically. I think the piece that we were so surprised by when we filed to be a 501c3, we were initially advised, be prepared. It's the middle of the pandemic. It's going to take about a year and a half before you ever get a response. And we thought, great, we have a little bit of time. We can connect with all of these incredible organizations and agencies and partners and say, hey, this is coming. We filed, and we did ask for an expedited filing as part of that, because we did see that there was such a need and so many individuals were impacted by the pandemic. And we put it out into the universe, and 6 days later, they came back with our 501c3 status. We went, here we go. Like,
somebody literally did like yes button.
Yeah.
Like,
and we just were, I mean, so overwhelmed with gratitude. And in the same breath, we have an incredible team of advisors and a board, and we all went to work right away on how do we bring this to life quickly.
Yeah.
And so September, they granted us our 501c3. By December, at that point, of course, as nurses, a lot of goals. And so I had said by New Year's Eve, we're going to gift our first grants away. We can figure this out and make this happen. And so that December, we called on New Year's Eve and awarded our first few grants, which we felt like was a great way to end a year that felt
great.
Hard.
Oh yeah.
To say the least.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and New Year's is always a rough time for people going through infertility. So I imagine for those grant recipients, that feeling of like, okay, I can go into this next year not feeling defeated, like I have something that is supporting me.
And especially the pandemic, really cool. It's like, yeah, knocking on pots and pans is great, but like, let's show me the money. Let me finally do IVF. Let's do something to really show that first responder appreciation.
Well, and you're just like either working your butt off or you're like sitting around at your house because there's nothing to do but think.
So true.
Where did the name Roaring Adventures come from?
You would think that my husband being a firefighter, roaring like a fire, it would come from that. And it actually originally stemmed from my daughter roared like a lion when she was little. And we felt like it did dovetail, into fire and connected it to that firefighter or first responder community. But adventures we often share with people, and her name is Rory, is our daughter's name. And so...
You're giving us all the feels here. That's so nice.
I didn't know that.
And so we felt like, we often tell people she's our greatest roaring adventure because that path to parenthood was hard. And much like many people experience, we really touched on every type of treatment, including adoption as part of that journey. So from kind of just like we talked about those initial lower tier, if you will, options from IUI to IUI and gonadotropins to IVF to, as you know, all of the other advances that come with that. But we felt like that was a way to kind of honor the full picture on anyone's path to parenthood. Often it's the most intimate and personal thing you ever do. And no one wants to experience infertility. I know for us, we see that a little over 950,000 Americans experience infertility. And that number, unfortunately, just keeps growing. But I think once you're a part of that club, you find that there are pretty incredible members, a part of that club. And so.
Well, even the word adventure is such an interesting choice because it's definitely not one that people normally associate with infertility. Like, kind of gives you that sense of like excitement and purpose. And that's kind of the opposite of how a lot of people feel. It's like, I didn't want to go on this adventure. What's going on? But it is true. Like you get that sense of, it's like once you reach your destination, then you kind of feel like, oh, wow, that was like this journey, this quest, this adventure I was on. And that's how I got here. And it's, I think, a much better positive word than a lot of the ways that we always talk about it as a struggle or a challenge. It's not to say it's not those things, but it is, you go through something very powerful. And I think it's a good way to recognize the importance of that.
At risk of alienating all of our Tolkien heads out there, just reminds me of Frodo and the Burden with the Ring, right? And it's like, it's an adventure, but a journey at the same time. So hopefully I got that right. I don't know.
And being in the Pacific Northwest, for us, my husband and I, we spent a lot of time outdoors. And we really felt like, if you're climbing South Sisters in Central Oregon and it feels grueling when you're in the beginning of that trek or that journey up the mountain. And by the time you get to the top of that mountain, you are blown away by the incredible views. And you look back at all the steps that you had to take to get to that point and are amazed.
And you think of all the things you want to write in a guidebook and you want to put in your pack. You want to tell other people that have to come beyond you up.
Tell me that.
So that's what you're doing with your organization. You're trying to help those other people. I think that's amazing.
Thank you so much. We feel very privileged and honored to have so many partners and just to be able to connect with so many people.
Amazing. I think that's a really amazing place to leave off. Anne, is there any lingering things that you want to ask about?
No, just I hope everyone's excited to listen to the snack and hear more about and the organization specifically and how you do your grant approvals and what that includes. So definitely, thank you so much. We are so happy to be able to have you come on and talk more about your amazing story and all the work that Roaring Adventures is doing.
Yeah, and can you just tell us where to find you?
You can find us online on Roaring Like a Fire Adventures with an S.org. We're also on social media. So if you're on Instagram, Roaring Adventures, followed by an _, and on Facebook as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of the Whole Pineapple Podcast. We hope it was helpful.
If you know someone who could benefit from hearing the podcast, we hope you'll share it with them.
And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review The Whole Pineapple on your favorite podcast app. Every rating and review makes us easier to find.
This podcast is sponsored by Seattle Reproductive Medicine and is produced by Audiotocracy Podcast Production. We'll see you next time. Have a delicious week.